Thank you everyone for being here. Again, my name is Jessica Laura. I am the program director at the Interfaith Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. The Interfaith Center is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to invite people from diverse secular, spiritual, and religious traditions to participate in one another's practices in order to cultivate appreciative understanding and friendship. We seek to unify people around common moral, social, and ethical concerns in order to build a more just and equitable society. And a few weeks ago, we started a new series called Ask Me Anything, and we're asking faith leaders from all different traditions to join us. And Jason Bracken is our speaker tonight. He was generous enough to volunteer to come on and talk to us about atheism. So this program is everything you ever wanted to know about atheism, but were afraid to ask. And atheism is the absence of belief or disbelief in the existence of a god or gods. And if religion is defined in terms of belief in spiritual beings, then atheism is the rejection of all religious belief. So what do atheists believe? Where does their morality come from, and what guides them as they navigate their way through life? So Jason, our speaker tonight, is a biologist, an educator, and a public servant. He's a council member for the city of Oxford, Ohio, and is completing a PhD in ecology, evolution, and environmental biology at Miami University. And Jason is also a board member at the Interfaith Center. So we're very lucky to have him on our board to represent the atheist point of view. And so welcome, Jason.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so if you have any opening words, we'll welcome you to say them now. If not, we'll get right into our list of questions because we have a long list tonight.
We have a very long list, so I think we should just get into the questions.
Awesome. I agree. So let's get started. The very first, a lot of these questions have a little bit of an explanation at the beginning to kind of frame the question. So bear with me as I go through these. How can an atheist maintain a positive outlook on life while believing that he or she came from particles in the universe, that his life is full of chance events that can wreck aims and hopes at any moment, and that he or she will become particles, and his or her life and works and loved ones will be utterly forgotten without comparing his or her beliefs with someone else's? I say this because I am saved and others are not, and I am realistic and others are wishful thinkers, are similar defense mechanisms that should not carry any weight in our judgment.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions in there, but I guess I'll start out saying I don't have trouble finding happiness, and there's about 1 billion plus people who are non-religious, and probably over 500 million that would consider themselves atheists, and they don't have trouble being happy. And I don't think being religious keeps us from those chance terrible events that affects everybody's lives. I know religion helps us feel some level of control, but clearly we all suffer in different ways. And so I don't think it prevents that, but yeah, it can help comfort, and I don't begrudge the comfort that religion gives to people. But also, I don't think we should try to believe in something because it's favorable. I would prefer we believe in something in terms of whether it's true or not, based on how realistic it is by looking at the evidence, and then dealing with that as best we can. And so if it was a cold, dark, desolate world, I would hope that we could acknowledge that and then look to each other for comfort and try and work our way through it. But again, I wouldn't begrudge the comfort that we seek during those conditions. But at the same time, I think they can lead, when you believe in something that might not be true, can ultimately lead to more harm than good. So it can be pretty tricky, but I don't have too much trouble staying happy and living the way I do. Does that answer it?
I think so. And I know you enough to know that you're always happy when I see you. So
I'm fortunate enough to live a pretty exciting life with lots of goals and joy among it.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, in theology, the ultimate one is called God. In philosophy, the highest virtue is called the good. All other virtues, such as honor, fairness, self-control, friendship, etc., are possible only because of the good. Are these simply two different names for the same one? And if not, what is the difference between them?
Yeah, I don't think they're necessarily the same, because the distinction is invoking a supernatural entity's existence, and then for some, then sort of pulling their morality from that belief in this God or entity. And that's where I think it diverges, because essentially, if you believe in a God and that morality should come from them, you no longer have to think it out in terms of ethics or empathy. It's dictated by the religious doctrine, right? The supposed will of God. So it doesn't necessarily stand that what God suggests in any given religion or belief is what follows from ethics, which can be vastly different. And we sort of know this, as many different religious beliefs have totally different moral standards, though a lot of them are similar, right? I mean, the golden rule comes around again and again among many different religions, and certainly in ethics, and certainly among many atheists and humanists. And that's because it has certain features that I think, while not objective in the sense of the universe, are objective between us, in that it deals with reciprocity and empathy and consideration, and only asking of others what you would ask of yourself towards them. And that's sort of the morality that I build around it. But I do think there's a distinction between God and the good, because in my opinion, the belief in God can sort of corrupt our ability to know what's true or our efforts for finding truth, but also developing a morality that's based in people and thought, and not simply from doctrine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'd happily take questions in the chat during all this if people want me to follow up on a question instead of just moving on from the next one, because I know these are really complicated. I wrote a lot of stuff and I'm only covering a third of it for any one of these questions.
Yeah, it is. It's a complex topic, and yeah, it is.
And I should also, sorry to cut you off, but just specify that, like, these are my personal views as an atheist. Outside of the strict definition of atheist, I can't speak to other atheists, right? So outside of the disbelief or lack of belief in God, these will be my thoughts. But I will say they're shared by many atheists, especially those who are humanists, which is sort of where I lead.
Okay, let's expound upon that, because this is one of our questions. Are all atheists humanists? And conversely, are all humanists atheists?
No to both of them. So, atheism is just the lack of belief in God. Humanist brings onto that sort of a view of the world epistemologically, meaning, how we gather evidence and view the world and what is true. And the humanist perspective suggests that we use empiricism, logic, and reason, and we use the evidence around us to make as best guess we can towards what is true. So it pushes aside doctrine and dogma and superstition. And then on the morality side, humanism also brings in the focus of people and concern for others specifically, rather than doctrine of any kind. And so not all atheists will be humanists. On the other side, while humanism is mostly based in atheism, there have been a number of religious people who have sort of co-adopted it, in the sense that they believe that their religious doctrines or their belief in their God's will matches the idea of humanism, in the sense that it's focused on people and concern for others and mostly about their welfare. And so you have Christian humanists, you have Buddhist humanists, you have many, but normally the majority are atheists or agnostic.
Okay, thank you for that distinction.
And actually, because on our website, we did a whole series on different religions and takes from individual people. I've already said what I think humanism is on our website, and I'm going to post that in the chat for anybody to read through. It also has a lot of links that might be useful.
Wonderful, thank you.
No problem.
Yeah. Okay, I am going to ask the next question here. If you have never experienced being on a path of embodiment, contemplative, or meditative practice, you will not have the experiences that would prove the validity of them. How can you negate something that you have never tried in earnest?
So this one, I could talk about this question alone all day. There are so many facets of it. So one, it's a little presumptive to consider that atheists have never been open to spirituality or the possibility of God. Most have, especially in the Western world, I would argue. I grew up Roman Catholic originally and was a believer at a time. The more I investigated that, the more I sort of left it, but it's not like I rejected it outright. And it's also tricky because philosophically, it tends to be very circular and sort of a tautological argument. But I'll stop with the big terms. What's tricky is it's subjective, right? So somebody's experience of that, somebody on the outside can't verify. And also different people's subjective experiences will sometimes contradict each other. So even they can't accept everyone else's claim to a spiritual enlightenment when it potentially disagrees with their own, right? So there's no way to know that. And there's also a big span in there, you know, somebody could sort of will themselves to have an experience because they already believe that. That's human nature. We often have confirmation bias. And then you could have those who have experiences that are very strong and real, but could border on psychosis, which many people wouldn't presume is a real religious experience. They might consider them crazy. And I'm not saying people who have religious experiences have psychosis, but that's the whole realm of experiences that people could have that could be rooted in something that is not necessarily supernatural, but is within themselves for good and for bad. Other aspects of this are really tricky too, that we don't reverse it. So for example, I was Roman Catholic, I believed, I was open to it, but I never had an experience in which God reached out to me and made me feel it in any level that was greater than what I experienced it because I grew up in it. So is that evidence for not believing in a God because I was open to it and I feel that God didn't reach out to me? And how often do we turn it around? You know, how often do people who are raised in religion and believe it with all their heart and earnestness, have they really contemplated that it might not be true, that it was because of their surroundings? And a lot of this should seem a little obvious because, you know, obviously people have a bias to believing what they grew up with within their family, within their culture, within their region. We're certainly influenced by that. And it's sort of not very helpful because of the circular nature of it, right? So you either had an experience that proved God to you and no one else can get there, or you didn't and no one else can know whether you truly were open to it or received it. And that's sort of the end of it. So I prefer to keep the arguments sort of as objective as possible rather than to try to dig into subjective personal experiences that are really hard to read. And I'll stop there, but I could really go on for a while. This is a super interesting question. There's so many different parts to it.
Yeah, it is. And it's all of this. And you mentioned, and you know, it's a really good point with all of these Ask Me Anything programs. We can all only speak freely on behalf of ourselves. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And this is a good example in this question. So do you agree that the world's religions are all speaking about universal truths from varying perspectives or worldviews based on their culture? Isn't atheism just one more perspective? In other words, another spoke in the wheel, if you will.
Yeah, so part of this was sort of already answered in a previous one, but there's a few aspects of this too. So again, I think the distinguished feature is belief in a supernatural entity, because in my opinion, that can warp your view of how you would otherwise gather truth, which is what you see around you. And again, some people do have personal experiences, but if they're not shared, that's hard to use as evidence. But in terms of, you know, what you believe, well, you know, we have people that don't believe in evolution, even though there's really good evidence for that, because they have religious doctrine they believe says otherwise, right? And so in that way is what I mean, that truth can be corrupted, right? And morally as well. Many people believe things that aren't necessarily ethical because they believe they're doing good, because they believe in a doctrine that says otherwise. So I think there's a distinction there, but also sort of in this question, which I think will pop up later, is atheism equivocal in judgment to epistemology, right? The idea that like, well, it's still belief, you could still be wrong, Well, certainly that is absolutely the case. It might be the case that there is a God. I don't claim to know that for certain at all. And most atheists don't. Most atheists would consider themselves agnostic atheists in the sense that they don't know for sure. They just don't have enough evidence to believe in a God. And so up until that evidence exists, they will essentially disbelieve, which is sort of a position that all of us take on anything that we don't know about, despite the typical argument that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I would turn that around, right? It's untenable to hold that you believe in everything that you don't have evidence for. And there's a good philosophical sort of analogy to this, Russell's teapot. You know, there might be a teapot orbiting the sun so distant and small that we could never possibly see it. And we have no way of knowing about it, right? Well, you can't presume that that teapot exists, and you can't presume all the things you can think of exist. So there really has to be strong evidence for something to exist, especially if it's supernatural, which by definition is beyond all our normal senses and what we know of nature, the entire history of our experiences and on the planet. So in that sense, I don't think atheism is equivalent in its appeal to epistemological weight, if that makes sense to people.
Yeah, and I think this question's very much related. If atheists believe there is no God or supernatural being, then they are expressing a belief. And so the question is, if atheists believe that there is no God or deity, can atheism be termed a religion per se? So very, very similar question that I think you've already answered in that. So
yeah, it's the same in the sense that it's a belief and could be wrong, but that's true of any belief. But I don't think it's the same in the types of evidence and how we get to truth. I think there's a big distinction there.
Yeah. Okay. Atheism means that one does not believe in a God, deity, or creator. Agnosticism means that one does not know if there is a God, deity, creator, which you just kind of mentioned. The question here is, in comparing and contrasting atheism and agnosticism, would you agree that atheism posits a belief in disbelief, whereas agnosticism declines to commit to any position based on the lack of knowledge of the truth? In other words, could atheism be described as a religion in terms of the practice of life based upon a particular belief or notion? And I just brought that in because it gives a little bit more of the definition of agnosticism. So.
Yeah, it gets a little tricky with the definitions. So I would agree that that's how you would define atheism and agnosticism specifically. But the truth is, one, almost every atheist has some sort of qualifier on there. Now, some can be hard positive atheists, which means they will declare, I know for certain there is no God, or some will even say, I am positive that there can't be a God. But the vast majority are agnostic atheists, right? They don't decline to take a position, which is really hard to do and live by, to just be neutral on that throughout all of society and all decisions. But instead, most people are agnostic atheists, and there's many agnostic theists too, right? They don't know for certain that there's a God, but they believe there's evidence for it. Well, this is the other side of that. We don't see enough evidence for it. We think there's a high bar for having enough evidence to believe in something supernatural, which also goes back to one of my other primary beliefs. I'm a naturalist, which has many different meanings, but one of the meanings is simply that you only believe in the natural and not the supernatural, nothing beyond that.
Okay.
Did I even answer the question in there, or did I just babble for?
No, I think you answered it.
Okay.
All right. This question is, I am generally curious how an educated atheist would respond to common arguments from religious monotheists, often Christians and Muslims, that atheism provides no basis for morality or caring for other beings.
So I would agree with that, because atheism in itself is simply not believing in a God, right? It doesn't attach a morality to it. And so you can fill that in with whatever you want. And if you want to be a absolutely terrible person, well, atheism in itself, by itself, doesn't prevent you from doing that or doesn't contradict anything. On the other side, you could be devoutly religious and also be a terrible person. And what I think is a little bit scarier is that you can be somebody who's religious and want to do good, but have a religious set of goals and values that are ultimately very bad, but you believe them to be good because that's the religion you follow and the morality that you believe is good. And we see this historically across all religions, right? And some people will say that that's just interpretation or misinterpretation, but I don't think that's really fair because we all interpret in different ways. And ultimately, even if that was a misinterpretation, should there be such a thing? Which also, by the way, I probably should have mentioned this earlier. I'm an atheist, but everyone else is essentially an atheist for every religion but their own. Right? I don't think that's a concept many people have considered, right? So if you believe in a specific religion, you've basically denied all the other religions unless that religion is somehow bringing them all together, which some people have. They are polytheistic or believe in a one that sort of joins them all, but many of them are contradictory and don't allow that. And so as I don't believe in any God, you don't believe in any God except your one or several that you happen to believe in. Where was I?
There's a question in the chat that's related to what you had answered just a moment ago, and I'll pull it out of there. The question is, what is your definition of supernatural and natural? What are the parameters of these definitions?
Sure. And actually, I can get back to that because I remember the original question, which was about how I derive my morality. Well, it doesn't come directly from atheism. I have to fill that in myself afterward. And I do that through basically examining ethics and coming to different conclusions. And it's mostly based around reciprocity, things I mentioned before. The golden rule comes out all the time amongst all these. It's a lot in empathy that, I know what it is to suffer. I don't want to see others suffer. If I'm going to ask other people not to allow suffering in me, then I have to be able to put that back. Yeah, and actually, I think I even had more on that might be good. So over the history, we've had both religious and atheistic people commit terrible harms. One of the worst being atheist. And Stalin, he might have taken the most lives in our history. But what's a little bit different about it is that many of the things done by the religious have been in the name of religion, where atheist doesn't dictate that morality. You have to come to that in yourself. So in that way, it can be sort of dangerous, even though religion can often lead people to do good things, it also has the potential to lead them to do bad things. Whereas if you're atheist, it's usually not too hard to get to the good stuff. And it's done by, contemplation and examination rather than simply reading it in scripture. Steven Weinberg, the famous physicist, Nobel Prize winner, said, with or without religion, good people can behave well and bad people can do evil. But for good people to do evil, that takes religion. Now, I don't necessarily believe that. It's not inherently true, but it can be generally true. And we've had that happen over our history on all sorts of levels. We have suicide bombers. We have people shooting abortion clinic doctors. We have people preventing the rights of the LGBTQ community. A lot of that is done in the name of religion, and they think they're doing good, right? I don't question their belief. I think it's earnest, but I think their belief is wrong, ethically, morally. And I think that's the issue. But the last one you brought up was, I forget, I lose track. Sorry, supernatural and natural. That can be difficult to put a line on because people have different definitions of the supernatural. We have one question that says, well, if God is supernatural and beyond our five senses, something like that, how can you expect to have evidence of him? Well, if by definition we can't have evidence of him, why should I believe in a God? By definition, he wouldn't be able to reach out to me in any way. And so I think that's tricky. But my definition of natural tends to be materialistic in the sense that I don't believe in spirits or something outside of what we've discovered or could discover through physics and science and experience in the world. That's a big start for me.
Let's move on here. The same sort of apologists who often claim that atheism does not have an objective basis for morality and question why atheists should care about the value of human life and treating others with dignity if the universe is a random accident and only matter and energy exist. Furthermore, how would an atheist worldview account for mathematics and logic? Are they also matter or not matter or energy, but something else?
Yeah, so that's really tricky because there's many different questions in there and they're going different directions. But I don't think you need to have dignity. I don't think you need eternity. I don't think you need divinity for there to be dignity. I think dignity is, in essence, it's meaning. And I think we derive meaning ourselves. For those existentialists out there, you might have heard the phrase, existence precedes essence, meaning you have to exist before you can create meaning with anything. It doesn't come inherently with the universe. You have to decide that for yourself. And even if you're religious, I would argue you've decided that for yourself, but you decided that it will come from this religion. And then you've said that this religion is an objective truth, and then you've lived by that. But that objective truth to you as a set of rules isn't objective to the rest of the world. In that sense, it's sort of a subjective objectivity. So I don't think you need that for dignity. And we see that, again, there's many, many atheists in the world who live happy lives, who care about others, who find value in others and value in their own experience, which they can also put on other people and understand how they're struggling through the world just like they are. Skipping to more sort of metaphysical, ontological questions, I would argue things like energy, that's material. From physics, we understand energy to be mass and mass energy. It's a different form of it, but it's all something that is very, very natural and is accepted by everybody in our physics community. As for thoughts and ideas like math and logic, that's always an interesting philosophical question. My personal belief, which is, again, sort of separate from atheism and humanism and all other such things, is that essentially they are relationships that are expressed through material objects in our world and can be duplicated. So they exist in patterns in our brain that we can follow in MRI machines. They exist on paper as little drawings that show the relationship of different things. And they relate to things that happen around us, right? You can see math operating in nature all the time, and it's because math exists, but that doesn't mean it exists as a separate entity from our physical realm. It exists as demonstrations of it in the physical realm. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm kind of pulling some random things from the chat that are related, and I think this one is very similar. What is your definition of empathy or compassion or love if materialism is your standard?
Sure. Well, just so people know, materialism doesn't really negate that. It just means that there isn't something beyond our physical realm that's necessary for love. As an experience, it'll be chemicals in our brain. And I know that sounds very cold, but that doesn't mean I can't give people hugs and I can't feel that and they can't feel it in the same way, right? Just because it's reductive doesn't change the experience. I don't need people to tell me that, compassion for somebody else has to come through some divinity or supernatural entity to have compassion for other people. I certainly do. Does that make sense? I'm asking that a lot.
Yeah, no, it's good. The follow-up here is, how do atheists define, in quotes, the heart versus the mind when neuroscientists, psychiatrists, etc., cannot actually trace the location of emotions, beliefs, etc.?
Yeah, I don't think there's a distinction between the heart and the brain in terms of them being two meaningful objects in determining who we are and how we act, right? The heart is pumping and doing all those physiological processes. And the brain, which also operates through normal chemical signals that go down to your gut and the rest of your body and all these hormones that interact with it, is still physical. I don't believe in a mental state that is separate from the physical, and most philosophers and most biologists, I don't think, do at the higher levels either. The comparison to a computer isn't very accurate because I think they work very differently, but in the sense that you can have very complicated, recursive and interactive beings or objects with the world is sort of the same, that you don't need something supernatural or extra there. And if anybody's dove really deeply into how computers work, and if you understand how such complicated things can develop just from zeros and ones through logic gates and binary, you realize, wow, like anything can be done with almost nothing if you just set it up in the right way. And we've had, millions of years of evolution to make us very good at perceiving the world, even if it's not always accurate.
Yeah. Cool. The next question, I love this question, by the way. It's one of my favorites. I'm curious about the local scene of atheist community building. I see that in the UK, there's a church-like community called Sunday Assembly that works towards the creation of community. Community seems especially important to me as a mother raising kids. I'm looking for community experiences that are not focused on them, meaning the kids, their education, achievement, enrichment, whatever, but rather on their learning to function within a community with many different ages, abilities, and perspectives. What type of efforts exist to present an atheist answer to the creation of this type of community?
Yeah, that's a great one. And that goes back to, me not begrudging and understanding the comfort that can come from religion, which part of that is the community and tradition around religion that adds so much to people's lives. And I would hope that we could translate that over, and we certainly can in some ways, right? There's no shortage of, social groups around certain topics. There are nature hike groups, there are people who are interested in art and all these things that can provide community. Many of them won't address, though, morality and life's big questions. There are humanist gatherings you could attend, but I would probably center on stuff that sort of tangentially addresses those questions. And that's sort of what we do, I think, at the Interfaith Center, right? So I've expressed my belief. I'm not a big fan of religion, right? I reject it in several ways, but I believe completely in freedom of thought. I believe completely in freedom of religion. And I want to work with other people and understand them towards goals that we all share. So I would argue the best way to do that is probably to reach out in the service of basic needs of other people, right? Which brings everybody together, and you can sort of focus on a meaning, I guess, we create, but that other people are important too, and that you ought to concern yourself with them as much as they concern themselves with you in terms of caring about each other's well-being.
Okay, great. I like that answer.
Pitch for the Interfaith Center in there.
Yeah, exactly. One of the strengths of mainstream religions is that many of them have core texts that adherents must struggle to understand and decipher. The Bible, which I know best, is filled with confusing stories, some of which seem mostly designed to shock, to make us sit up and pay attention, and to engage in the struggle with what we believe. What core text would you suggest in an atheist practice? And would there be parables that you would return to again and again?
Oh boy, that's, I would like to say that it's better not to have a single text, that you want to diversify your knowledge as much as possible, including reading the texts of religions. And there are certainly things to gain even from religions whose core tenets I do not believe. The Sermon on the Mount is a pretty great lesson, I think, for everyone, even us atheists. And I think that exists in almost all religious texts. I also sadly think there's some pretty not good things in almost all religious texts. But if you open yourself up to these things, take in as much as possible about everything, which is hard, I know it's asking a lot, but I think you can derive more from that about the world and about our relationships in it. To not limit ourselves and be open to the good and bad and judge them adequately.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons we're doing this series too, is to allow people the opportunity to explore, because when you are raised in a specific tradition, oftentimes you just don't have exposure to those other things. And it's really eye-opening to explore all the different religions and see what they're talking about. So
it is. So what's kind of interesting is many people that I've introduced that I'm an atheist to were shocked, like they couldn't believe it. It was never really an intellectual option that they considered because they grew up with faith all around them. And so it was never, it's not conceivable, and they never tried to conceive it. And in some ways, other religions that are close to that culture already, that wouldn't be, they wouldn't be that new, right? But atheism is just the absence of that belief. Well, if you don't know much about atheism or couldn't possibly accept that, then you probably could never accept a whole different set of beliefs that you were never ever exposed to that would replace the ones you have. And so, yeah, we definitely need to communicate between all religions and non-religious. Otherwise, a lot of people are going to miss out on things that they never even fathomed, I think.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks. Can you imagine a spiritual practice based around scientific observation and discussion? What would this look like if practiced in community? And how would, from the perspective of children, participating in this community be different than going to school?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess it comes down to the definition of spiritual, because some people view that as supernatural and other people view that as sort of just experiential. That doesn't necessarily relate to the supernatural. So I'm heavily involved in nature. I'm out there all the time, studying snakes and sometimes geology, and I find it fascinating. And my curiosity is piqued, and I'm super interested in it, and I seek it out, and it develops on that. And some people might call that spiritual. I wouldn't, but I can certainly understand that. And the experience might be similar, and it might in some way provide some of the need that people have that religion often fills in. So I don't know if it would be specific. I think all those things sort of exist, right? One thing I can say many people will call spiritual, and I don't care if you call it spiritual or not, it is amazing. If anybody gets a chance to see a total solar eclipse and you're not outside the bounds, but you're within the direct line of it, it is amazing and something everybody should see. And so that would be one such event that, people could derive something that might be spiritual. Either way, I think it's a great experience and people should do it.
Yeah. So this is a little bit more personal. How and when did you come to be an atheist?
I don't know if there was a single moment, or if there was, I've forgotten it, but probably have been questioning since middle school, maybe, and probably definitively for sure in college, I think, if not before then.
What do atheists believe is the purpose of the arts if they are only manifestations of humankind and not of any other species?
I don't think it matters that it doesn't happen in other species. I think that's sort of so it goes by a couple different names. One is the naturalist fallacy, and the other is the is-ought problem, right? Just because we are natural and part of nature doesn't mean we should inherently do what other things in nature do, right? Just because things are that way doesn't mean they necessarily should be that way. So I don't think other animals not having art, and for all I know, some of them might, depending on how we define that. There's certainly other animals that use tools, and certainly animals that enjoy different experiences of their senses. And some of them are probably visual too, might even be like we would typically think of art. And certainly with music, especially if you think about something with songbirds and things like that. But that's a little bit off the point. Whether animals appreciate it or not, of which we are, doesn't matter to me. I appreciate it. I have great experiences from it, and I can derive meaning and connection and relationships with it. I'm a huge fan of the arts. I am constantly moved by music and movies and books. And I think it's fantastic, and it helps me in deriving truth and morality because it gets me to think about all these things internally and externally.
This is a corollary. What is the evolutionary basis for the arts? What function do they serve?
Yeah, so there might not be. So if you understand evolution, it's not guided, it's random. But when a random thing works out, it can keep working out. and sort of self-reproduce, right? But it also goes off weird tangents, and parts of it that could be beneficial in terms of reproduction might keep going, but you'll pull stuff out of them, right? So many of the ways people think in modern days is beneficial towards reproduction, and some of them are not. I'm 41 years old. I don't have kids and don't plan on having kids. But here I am. Somehow my mind brought me to that, even though my legacy won't live on in that way, right? And arts probably stemmed mostly from the benefit of communication with each other, right? That's how we got speech. That's how we got a lot of drawings and written records. They were very beneficial to us to retain information and to share information with each other. I would imagine that it's an expression of that, and that evolutionarily there are desires there. Sort of the same way when I think of music, I think a lot of that as an expression of our language, not just through lyrics, but the music itself is an expression of emotion and communication. And so I think there's an explanation in evolution, but our experiences go way beyond that. And it's not quite so mechanistic as people maybe think it might be.
Okay, thank you. To what extent is atheism a reaction to institutionalized religion versus an independent conclusion about existence?
I like that. It is certainly both, and it depends on the individual. I think there are many people who initially react out of, a pushback to some of the flaws of organized religion, but then that just allows them to think about it deeply for the first time, because they might not have before then. And when they deeply think about it and consider things without a built-in bias, because they're coming from it with already an existing religious belief, they're more open to viewing it a little more rationally, maybe. But it certainly exists in all forms. And many atheists across the world, sadly, are only atheists because they were raised where religion was not allowed by the state, right? So all the different ways. In the Western world, where we tend to be a little more free than some of those areas, it's both reactionary and deep philosophical thought.
If atheists are right that there is no God, then both atheists and religious people derive morality from the same place, from their human experiences. Correct? The question is, do you agree?
I do agree, yeah. Yeah, because I am an atheist and I don't believe there's a God communicating in different ways to people. And I think it all comes from human experiences. And some of them might be meaningfully experiential, like those who ask questions about, well, have you opened yourself up and then experienced God personally? And then others just because they were born into it. And that doesn't mean they don't believe it or it's not earnest, but when you grow up all around it, it's very easy to accept, and even accept it more heartily because you haven't known otherwise, or it's been with you for such a long time. It's hard to envision it not being true.
Okay, what is truth?
Yeah, I think it's our representation to what actually exists outside our replica models in our head. And I don't think we can ever fully know it in multiple ways, in the sense that a replication, a model, can never actually be what it's representing, right? And also in the sense that we're incredibly limited, and our senses are not high fidelity, our memory is not high fidelity. There were a lot of questions that sort of asked about whether it's a little egotistical maybe, or arrogant to be an atheist given what it claims. But the truth is that most atheists, including myself, we understand we know very, very little. And I don't think although we can be a bit of a jerk sometimes, that's for sure. But most of us, I think, understand that we don't know that much, and we don't claim to, but we don't want to claim more than we have evidence for. And so I think that's why we don't get to religious belief. I just don't think there's enough there for us to be sure of it.
And do you place humans in a higher level of importance than other animals?
So inherently, no. But in practice, yes, because as I see it, it should mostly be based around the capacity to suffer. And so the capacity to suffer means tending to be more complex, right? So if you have self-consciousness, self-awareness, if you can feel pain as we understand it, or other forms, as long as we understand that it's pain, then you can suffer. And I want to eliminate suffering. So I think humans can suffer in multiple ways, not just the pain of, a cut or something like that, but in the sense that we have plans and goals and identities and ideas that can be quashed or taken away from us. And it can be emotionally brutal. And so there's many different ways to suffer. And generally, the more complex you are and the more self-awareness you have, the greater your capacity to suffer. And so humans would be probably at the top of the list, but there would be many other animals that get very high. And that doesn't mean, also, I should specify, we don't disregard the rights of all other animals, right? But if you have to prioritize, which technically we do, because at any given moment, I'm killing 1 million bacterial cells, right? Just by moving my hand. There's not much I can do about that. And every choice we make has so many repercussions. But if we prioritize and we try to help those that can truly suffer, then we will look way past humans and we will go down as far as you can. And actually, I'm going to use this as an excuse to bring up another separate philosophical thought. That is sort of our moral circle. If people are familiar with Peter Singer, animals activist, but as an animal rights activist, but also way beyond that, a great ethicist. The history of the world and our view of morality has grown from thinking about the self to family members, to tribes, to states, to nations, and also between groups that have typically fought, right? We've become way better, though still major issues, about fighting about religion, right? We've become way better about issues of race and sex and sexuality and orientation. All these things we grow, we move out from ourselves and go, it's not just about me. I understand the plight of others and now I care about them and they are in my moral circle of concern. Well, you can expand that out to animals too, and know that they are living, they suffer, and you have a role to play in whether you increase that suffering or decrease it, just like you do with people. And I think that is my position, and that's sort of the way the world's going. It might be a little bit of a tangent, but I do think we'll look back many decades from now and think that we've treated the animals in this world horribly, both in our wild ecosystems, but also in our factory farming and how little concern we've shown for them. So a bit of a tangent, but I think that answers the question.
Oh, and it's a good one. It's another, demonstration of where morality comes from an atheist perspective. So
yeah, it's an extension of empathy. The better you are at empathizing with those that are least similar to you, I think you're really winning at that idea of morality for all, and that others consider you in that same sense that you consider them.
Yeah, great. We have about 10 minutes left. If there's anyone on the live Zoom here who would like to ask a question, just raise your hand if you would. And I will give you guys some more time to think about that. We do have a few more questions in the chat. Jason?
I think Patrick is raising his hand, but you might not see his video.
I may not see it. Patrick, go. Yes.
Hi, Jason. Thank you for an excellent presentation tonight. I applaud your thoughtfulness and your intelligence in sharing all of this with us. I came across a quote just the other day, and I knew I would be attending this tonight, and I would like to share that with you just to see what reaction you have to this. And the quote is, I used to be an atheist until I realized that I am God.
Yeah. Many different ways to interpret that.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, there's, in the philosophical sense, an egotistical, solipsistic way you can sort of look at that. And there's another way, both existential and maybe a little Nietzsche, that you could be dismissive. But you could also look at it, which is a way I prefer to look at it, in that we're ultimately forced to make our own meaning, and that truth as we see it will be derive from us, even if there is a real world and other bodies and thoughts out there. And that's okay as long as you're doing the best to make something of it, I guess. I don't know. That is interesting, though.
Yeah,
I would love to hear other people's thoughts on that, actually.
it sounds very much non-dualistic to me. Yeah. We have another question here. How do you view neo-atheism or new atheism? And for those of us who may not know what that means, if you wouldn't mind defining that for us.
Sure. And actually, I'm not sure it has a definition outside of just the latest atheist speakers that were very publicly known and sort of appreciated. So there was sort of a movement towards atheists that probably started about 15 years ago, maybe 10. Daniel Dennett, who's one of my favorite philosophers of all time, an experimental philosopher too. He's brilliant. I suggest you read on him. Richard Dawkins, who's a famous biologist. I'm Sam Harris, an intellectual who writes a lot in a number of areas. I appreciate them for many things. I disagree with them in a number of areas, depending on which one we're talking about. I think they did a lot of good in bringing atheism to sort of the people, because honestly, there wasn't much of a movement before them, and they had a series of books that really got a lot of attention, and they did a lot of interviews and talks. Sometimes they can be viewed as a little militant, not in the sense that they're literally forceful or have a military of any sort or want violence against anybody else, but that they're very rigid, and atheists do come off as smug a lot, including myself. They had some of that. So while they turned on a lot of people to atheism, I think they pushed off some of them too. And since they're so outspoken about so many areas, they've both won applause and lost applause, depending on which topic we're talking about. Yeah, sorry for those who aren't familiar. It's just way too much to get into, but each one of them has many thoughts on any given political or socioeconomic topic. So it's hard to agree with them on everything or disagree with them on everything. They're very smart people, though, I will say that. But even if you disagree with them, you will probably learn a lot from reading their material on any subject, and especially atheism.
Great. Are there any additional questions?
Oh, Christopher Hitchens, too, was another one of the new atheists who's passed away, sadly. I think Don and Zephyr, I think.
Yeah, this is Don. I did have my hand up. Thank you. And you've probably said this, but all the thoughts that have entered my brain are scattered around. What would you say is your belief?
What is my positive belief?
Yeah.
Well, I do believe that there is no God. I do believe in the universe as I've taken it in. I also understand that that's totally, fallible. But I do the best I can with what I take in. Does that help?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. Zephyr?
Hello, thank you.
Hey, was I pronouncing your name correctly?
It's Zafar, but no problem at all.
Yeah, Zafar, sorry about that.
I appreciated your talk. I got to know a little more about atheism. You said that by natural you meant materialistic, and so as I understood you as saying that you take matter as the essential form of existence, and whatever there is in matter, that's what we have, and there's nothing else. Have I understood you correctly?
Sort of. What's tricky is when I say matter, it's just the easiest way to suggest everything we know from physics, our exploration there. So energy, for example, and because energy is matter and matter is energy is the same thing. It's hard to speak about this because essentially I'm saying anything that we don't already know exists through science, something beyond that, something supernatural, right? And a more concrete example is for most of the history of modern civilization, we thought there was a separation between thought, the mental, and the physical. I would argue that, and so would many other people in their fields, that there is no mental fluid, liquid, material, or something different from physics that exists. So our thoughts are just us experiencing the process of physical entities. And I should say that even though naturalism, for me, materialism and naturalism go together, that doesn't necessarily work for everyone else. But by the definition of naturalism, if it's accepting science and physics as we know it, then that would be the case. Sorry, does that work? Did that clear anything up or just make it more complicated?
Well, I guess we are sort of on the same page.
Yeah.
If
sorry, go ahead.
So you're saying physics, what physics tells us is that which exists and there isn't anything else, mental or otherwise. My experience tells me that the way you look at existence changes your experience. And so if you, for example, if you're a carpenter, you look at a tree, what you experience with the tree or what you see is different when you're a zoologist. The experience is not the same. So reality changes with the perspective that you take. So if the existence, let's suppose that the existence is like a book, what we call a book, but we don't know it's a book. If we say physics is all that exists, and matter is the essential, then even though it's a book that has meaning, that tells us something about the author, if we look at it just as material, we will never try to get the meaning. Now, you may say that you can get a meaning, but that will be personal and you won't be able to prove it to anybody else. But if there are in the history of mankind many people reading the existence, getting meaning, and they agree on the sort of meaning, just as the scientific community agree on certain things, even though they're not 100%, they don't always 100% agree on things. Wouldn't that tell us something about this existence, that it may have meaning, carrying information about its maker?
So I think that is possible. And I do agree with you. However, whatever beliefs you already come in with changes the world and how you see it and how you interpret it. And it generally biases it towards what you already believe. And that's true for the atheist and for the theist. However, one of the problems with that is that, and we sort of addressed this in a couple of questions, why have I not had those experiences? And why have these experiences of others contradicted each other in ways that they are not compatible? So I don't think you can claim that many people have had similar experiences, and that is a form of evidence. I don't think it's very strong, but it is evidence and it gathers evidence. However, there's many absences there and sort of some contradictions in that. Does that make sense?
Thank you very much.
Sure. And I forget, there were a few other hands, but I don't see them right now. Yeah, if somebody had their hand up and put it down, feel free to put it up again, or not, whatever you're comfortable with. So there's one in the chat. To what extent were you educated in the traditions, texts, beliefs of Christianity before you decided to reject it? So I think I said that I started to question more maybe around middle school. And up to that point, I had gone to church, again, Roman Catholic was my family. I'd gone to church a number of times, very often, fairly consistently, and also done CDC till about middle school, I think.
Great. Last call for questions. We're right at 8 o'clock. So if there's any last question, we're willing to take one more if you've got it.
Last chance.
Yep.
As personal as you want.
Patrick.
Oh, I think you're muted, Patrick. There you go.
Okay, yes. So my question is, how does your family respond to your atheism if you grew up in a Catholic family, as I did? What's that been like?
Yeah, so it hasn't been too bad. Honestly, what's kind of weird is some that were very bad at following the doctrine of the religion were some of the ones that were maddest at me. While those that were better at following it, honestly, my family had some trouble, so nobody was great at following it. But those that were more religious actually took it a little easier. And sometimes we would debate, friendly debate, nothing bad there. Politics was much worse, but it wasn't that bad. But I know for some, they can really feel alienated. And for some, they can certainly be kicked out of the family or disowned, which I think is pretty terrible. But it wasn't that bad for me. What was harder is there was some existential angst that came with having this religious belief and then sort of what I feel is awakening to sort of a more natural explanation to things. But pulling from that, it was sometimes very difficult. Existentialism by itself is difficult if you really experience it. But also the religious stretch from that to atheism was a bit tough for me. And certain revelations about religion that I had along the way. I can remember distinctly when I realized that God might destroy the world to rebuild it. And that was very scary to me as a child. Also, what's interesting is I've had friends who have grown up always atheist in a culture that atheism was default. They didn't talk about it. They didn't even have a name for it. It just was no religion. And they had no such angst, no such missing. They just lived their life like anybody else, and you would never know otherwise. So it might even be harder to pull yourself away. I mean, in many ways, it obviously will be. But it might even be harder than you think just changing your beliefs. It might be a little emotionally stretching. But I think it's good and it's freeing and not in a morally relativistic way. Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jason. This was wonderful, really interesting, and just I think we've all learned a lot. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, go right ahead.
I was just going to say thank you for this opportunity. It's great. I think people need to hear about this, especially since atheists are one of them. I feel very, very privileged in many, many ways. And you almost have to be privileged to become an atheist in many cases, especially in the Western world, because, you know, if you don't struggle with things, it's a lot easier to sort of give up God and religion because it's very comforting. And so in many ways, I'm very privileged, but I will say in many ways, atheists are pretty discriminated against in ways that often aren't felt. Like, I don't feel like I'm oppressed in any way. For example, if you do surveys, one of the groups that is least likely to become a politician or a public servant like I've become is atheists. Many people say they would never vote for an atheist no matter what. And that goes across many cultures and religions and beliefs, which is pretty rough and probably not good for the world. So I'm glad to be able to speak to that. And I will say this too, that a lot of this comes naturally to me because I've had these talks again and again and again, and not always in fierce debate. Most of them were like hanging out with friends at 3 a.m. and talking about life and family and society and all these things. And so it's one of my favorite things to do. And I think it's when you really get to know other people and you really get to know yourself. So hopefully we can have more of these talks. And I think we've already had a pretty good series on them. So I hope it keeps going.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that again is one of the aims of this programming is to break stereotypes about any tradition or lack of tradition or non-tradition or non-belief and all of those good things. So thanks again. Thank you everyone who is here with us on Zoom. And if you have an interest in interfaith programming, please check out our YouTube channel. You can find all of our previous programs, and there are lots of really great ones on there. And you can always visit us online at oxfordinterfaithcenter.org. And I would also like to mention that we are a nonprofit. We're a small group of individuals working toward our mission. And this is part of the mission, is to educate and to inspire people and to promote more equity and justice in the world. So since it is Giving Tuesday, if you'd like to make a donation to the Interfaith Center, we would really greatly appreciate it. It supports our programming and helping us to continue this work. So again, it's oxfordinterfaithcenter.org. And everyone have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.